Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. We've been following the case in Myanmar of the coup against ousted leader Aung San Suu Kyi. Now, she was detained on February the 1st after the government basically charged her with unregistered walkie-talkies. This was a laughable charge and was basically viewed as a pretext for her arrest. Eyebrows raised that much more so on Tuesday when her lawyers told journalists that Aung San Suu Kyi had been charged with violating Article 25 of the National Disaster Management Law. It is not entirely clear how she apparently violated that law, but this is, again, being thought of as being a pretext for prosecution without prosecution, basically being able to hold her without necessarily going through the entire legal case of charging her, or for that matter, of a court case. Joining us to speak about this is a fascinating case because Myanmar had been basically under military rule for a while. Suu Kyi was basically the leader that took over after that, and it's a little bit distressing to see the coup take place and basically her deposed back to house arrest, where she was in house arrest for 15 years prior. Joining us to speak about this is KJ No. He's a journalist, political analyst, writer, and teacher specializing in the geopolitics of the Asia-Pacific region. He is contributor to the book Capitalism on a Ventilator. Once censored by Amazon, is now available at iacenter.org. KJ, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
Now, did I describe that adequately, or is there anything else that you want to add to it? I guess I was trying to make the point that it seems like they're trying to put her back under house arrest. And they're looking for any charge that they can stick on her to do so.
Yes, I mean, it's clear that this is largely pretextual. These are political acts, and they're looking for pretextual reasons to hold her. Her initial detention was set to expire very soon. So with these new charges, they can hold her until March 1st. But the larger context, again, is that, first, the walkie-talkie thing has to do with the fact that the country is under constant civil war. There are 21 ethnic armed organizations, some which are really, really powerful armies, and there are at least 1,000 armed militia groups. So the government theoretically has a pretext to, kind of control the importation of technically, what could be used as war material. But this second charge, is clearly built out of thin air. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to hobble her for at least the year that they claim they need in order to put things back into order. And the reason for that, once again, the reason for their coup is, of course, the system in Myanmar was built by the military. At no point should we delude ourselves that democracy was won in Myanmar. The military gave a kind of civilianized system to the general population, and what they gave, they can take away, which is exactly what they did. But that said, they did have concerns about the election itself. And my thinking is that they think that when elections are held again, that they can pull out ahead and change the balance of forces.
And right now, I mean, military government at this time, and the word is there are hundreds of thousands of people in the streets with protests that have been accelerating. UN spectators are saying they're extremely worried about how this is going to fall out. If this comes to violence, what level of violence do you expect here? And what would come out of that? How much of a grip do you think the protesters can actually gain on the reins of power here? Or is this something where it's nominal pushback? What do you see coming out of this, KJ?
Well, I think that everybody's holding their breath. There's a lot of fear. People are not sleeping. And I think, the worst outcome, violent bloodshed, is a real possibility. One of the signals that leads many experts to believe that that's the case is that the counterinsurgency troops of the Light Infantry Division, this is Division 77, that were fighting the Arakan army in Rakhine State, have been pulled out of an active conflict, and they have been distributed into the main capitals. So purely from a psychological standpoint, it's terrifying. But the fact that you have, battle-hardened counterinsurgency troops in the streets, I think, is a very, very bad
Yeah, that's
signal.
disturbing. To put it mildly, that's disturbing.
Yes.
And if you were living there, it would be disturbing. You know what I mean? To know that, that basically the military is trying to rip control back. And I do use the term rip control back. So right now, there are protests in the largest city of Yangon, the broken car protests. Basically, they drive their car in the street and say, oh, car's broken, they get up and leave. And apparently there are like thousands of these with the idea of slowing down the military and slowing down the police from what they are trying to do in regards to maintaining and instituting the coup, the military coup. Where does this go? I mean, like how far do you think they'll be willing to push this? I mean, are we talking about, like you said, bloodshed? Are we talking about people being killed in the streets? And one thing that I do want to point out, it was, the military was at risk of losing power, I think. I mean, because if you think of the elections that they lost and the actions that Aung San Suu Kyi was taking in the political space, she was basically trying to pull the control away from the military into more democratic hands. And it seems that the military recognized what was taking place and responded as such. Now, is the public going to be okay with the military taking back control after the public recognized that it had some level of democracy, even if it was fledgling, even if it was on some level theatrical? It's still, you know what I mean? Like for example, if the president of the United States had a copy and they were using that copy because the president, the real one, had died. This was a movie. That president who's a copy has power. Even if the president is just theatrical, even if it's just for play reasons, that president has power because that president gets out there and responds to the population. I guess I'll look at Suu Kyi in similar terms, that even though the military basically relinquished a certain degree of control, she ended up with power. And she was trying to use the power that she had in that position to undermine the military to basically make it a democratic state. I guess what I'm asking is the public itself going to be okay with the military taking power? And it seems like if the military is going to escalate, the public also may escalate their pushback of the military regaining control.
It's a very complex scenario. And, at the risk of, muddying the waters too much, the first thing I would say is that the NLD does not have uniform support. And this has to do with, once again, the fact that Myanmar is a multi-ethnic state. And even during the elections, the government disenfranchised between 1.5 to 2.5 million voters. They prevented the second largest party from running. They charged an opposition candidate with sedition, and they reduced the number of parliamentary seats needed to form the government. And so there are actually a lot of ethnic minorities that are fairly pissed off at the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi, not the least of, would be the people in Rakhine State. So the military is not as blunt and as misguided as we might think it is. I think they're banking on the fact that they can, if they hold power for a year, defang the key power centers of the NLD, and then, look for their court or create alliances with various ethnic minorities, that they might actually have a chance at continuing the system as it is. Now, as it is, the system already gives 25% of the seats to the military, so they're already in a very strong position. They just wanted to fortify their position and prevent any further attrition. The other point that I will make is that Aung San Suu Kyi actually was very close to the military. Her father founded the Burmese military. She grew up on the laps of generals. And I think that there was a kind of hubris there, which she believed that by bringing the military close to her, that she would be able to slowly, kind of take power for the NLD for herself. And that was shown in the first action she took, where she took 5 ministerial positions for herself. And then just very recently, she ignored 23 letters from the military asking her to address the election fraud. So there was a kind of way in which she overplayed her hand and misread the risk aversity or the risk-taking chances of the military. And I think this is why we've gotten to this stage. But it could end very badly. I think the military thinks that it can have a political solution. But I'm very concerned, and I think many people on the ground are concerned that this could end very badly with massive bloodshed.
And so, bringing this into the global political sphere, do you see the United States, China, India, other major powers with investments in the country, in the region, deciding to get involved if this gets to that point? If so, who do you think would land where? And we were talking about this the last time we spoke with you. You were talking about Myanmar as a main point of attention and contention between the United States and China, with the port as a major supply route for China's Belt and Road Initiative. What do you think would happen if this escalated to, bloodshed, to more extreme bloodshed? Who would get involved, and what would come out of that, KJ?
I think they're very fairly. There are a number of different scenarios possible. The U.S. hedged and put most of its bets on the NLD. They were taking down Aung San Suu Kyi after having put her into power. We can argue very clearly that in 2015 she got power because of the support of the U.S. Ambassador, who was an expert in elections and polling. But China has hedged its bets. It was actually closest to the civilian government, Aung San Suu Kyi, but they had also hedged their bets with the military and the ethnic armed organizations and the ethnic minorities that they associate with. So the Chinese will largely come out ahead. Now, they have asked for the restoration of civilian rule, but they're not going to be overtly interfere in Myanmar politics, because that's just not their style. On the other hand, the U.S. seems to be pushing the envelope, and I think the U.S. has a plan where it either wants the restoration of the civilian government under its terms, or it is not averse, as usual, to breaking the country into total chaos, which, as I pointed out, with 21 ethnic armed organizations and over 1,000 militia, that is very much a possibility.
And that would be true chaos. I mean, speaking of bloodshed, like you're talking about, and I'm hoping here that the protests don't escalate into not just pushback against the government, but squabbling, fighting, killings between these different groups who, like you said, many have vested interests and are pissed about what happened during the election. We're out of time, though. KJ, I want to thank you again for joining us. For those listening, that was the voice of KJ No, journalist, political analyst, writer, and teacher specializing in the geopolitics of the Asia-Pacific region. He is a contributor to the book, Capitalism on a Ventilator. Once censored by Amazon, that book is now available at iacenter.org. We'll be back in a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be back on the other side of this break.
KJ, thank you again. I got a question for you, KJ, before you leave, though. You made the point that the United States started to push the envelope. Do you think they're pushing the envelope to the point where they would get militarily involved? Or, for that matter, get involved in the way that they would get involved in like Syria or Libya or some of the countries in South America, basically putting money and resources in the hands of opposition groups in order to get the effect that they want within the context of the country? I mean, do you think we'd go that far?
It's possible, but I would think it would be very, very foolhardy. As I point out, if they entered militarily, it would be like stepping into a crossfire hurricane because of all the armed groups. And the other piece to remember is that, the 1,200-mile border with China will not tolerate a U.S. intervention or even a limited or proxy U.S. intervention on its border. That happened in 1950 with the Kuomintang. The CIA gave money to the Shan and the Kuomintang, and the Chinese obliterated them. So the Chinese will not tolerate it. And they have ways of feeding money and weapons to many of the ethnic insurgencies, which they actually share, kind of a common culture with, to prevent that from happening. So
would that be the response, KJ? Sorry for interrupting, but would that be what the Chinese government would do there effectively? Is if the United States decided to get involved and do their end of funding, the Chinese would respond in kind, and this would turn into a proxy conflict in that country. Is that what you see happening potentially?
It's possible. Yes, I think the Chinese would definitely escalate militarily. I mean, when I say these are armed, ethnic armed organizations, I'm not talking of the Zapatista army. These are organizations that have 50 to 100,000 troops. They own their own munitions factories. And if somebody started to come in and, mess with them, this would turn into, total war. This is one reason why the military has never been able to dominate the political scene in Myanmar, because these ethnic armed insurgencies are really powerful, and China has the winning hand.
So
with
how
all
did
of them.
Suu Kyi keep it together? I mean, with this many groups and with this many differences, and for that matter, this many, like you say, violent or at the very least militaristically oriented groups, how did she keep that entire country together? I mean, honestly, at one point they were concerned she was going to be a dictator. The way she was isolating power. But that just seems like if the military couldn't keep it together, how did she, or how did the democratic system?
Well, it's a very fragile system. I mean, I think people don't realize how fragile it is. But the first thing is that her father founded the Burmese military. So she was relying on that. She was really relying on the fact that she could go to the general and say, I remember you. My father, nurtured you and raised you. I grew up on the lap of your grandfather, the general so-and-so. So first she brought the military, close to her chest, which was a mistake. And then the second thing was that, and this was a big mistake, was that as she was constituting her government, she did not bring in the ethnic minorities into her cabinet. She ran it with largely a military and Burmese majority government. And many of the minorities felt really, really betrayed. In fact, she arrested some of the key minority leaders. And of course, she started or greenlighted the war in Rakhine State against the Rohingya and the Rakhine. And so she has lost a lot of credibility with ethnic minorities. And so the whole thing was held together with duct tape and glue. And it's not surprising that it's fallen apart.
But was it really
again.
a mistake going with the military? I mean, it's almost like it seems she had to do that. Otherwise, meaning it seems like it was no way around that.
I agree. Yeah. She didn't have a choice. I mean, the military is the key force that has held the country together since 1962. And they're the people who wrote the Constitution that gave her power. But the piece that she got wrong, and this is my argument, is the piece that she got wrong is that even as she courted the military, she was extremely disrespectful to them. They sent her 23 official letters asking her to address the election irregularities, and she laughed in their face. And from that standpoint, they consider her too arrogant. And so they had to take it down. It's not even a matter of course, there are economic and political interests involved, but purely from a kind of standpoint of losing face, I think that the generals just couldn't take it anymore.
And that's in just 3 months, right? You're talking about since the election. That was just this last November. That's a couple letters a week, effectively.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yes.
Yes. And, the Carter administration, the Carter Center has actually, pointed out some of these things. So, I'm not, it's a complex situation, but U.S. observers on the ground have pointed out some of these, irregularities.
It seems like she had one or two ways. She either had to go with the military or go with the ethnic groups. And it seems like she chose neither. In which case, she was basically by herself. Yeah.
Well, even then, if she decides to go with some of the ethnic minorities, there are a lot of them, and so problems abound there. But if she had tried to hew herself more closely to the military, I can imagine This is a guess. I'd actually want you to correct me on this. And we're the interview is officially done. We're just having a conversation at this point. I'm guessing the U.S. would have pushed back against that. I'm guessing if she had wedded herself more closely to the military, but please correct me if I'm wrong. I would just get the sense that the U.S. wouldn't like that. But what's your take, KJ?
I don't think the U.S. is necessarily opposed to the military, as long as the military would have come along in a more kind of U.S. led mindset. Now, the U.S. had direct connections with the Myanmar military until 2017. They were doing training. They were giving them, support. They were trying to build a military connection. So that was definitely in the works. But the ethnic minority issue is the key issue around in Myanmar, because originally in 1947, they were promised the right to secede. There are at least 7 or 8 ethnic minorities. And when they signed the agreement that created the Union of Burma as a confederated state, they were told that within 10 years, they had the option to secede if things were not working for them. And then, the next year, the entire country broke out into war, and none of these things were allowed. So that's the key issue.
Wow. It just sounds like she would have needed to bring these minorities into the government. I mean, the politics that is taking place here is phenomenally complex. Because, like you said, she was raised by the military. By the same token, she ended up in power, but that was a tenuous power at that, because, you have the political system, but the military has the weapons and the guns. Yeah. Then you have an ethnic aspect of all of these other groups that you also have to that is maddening politics. That is maddening politics.
Yes, exactly. Yes. The British, it has to do with the British rule, because when the British colonized Burma, unlike India or many other countries, they ruled it under direct military occupation. That was unusual for the British, but they ruled it under direct military occupation. And then the other thing they did was they created an ethnic hierarchy with certain groups controlling other groups, so much so that when the War of Liberation broke out, for example, the Karen fought on the side of the British to prevent independence. So, that's the background, and it really goes back to British colonial practices of divide and rule, or divide and conquer. And at the same time, Aung San Suu Kyi was a rather flawed candidate, because she was raised in the heady atmosphere of the transnational elite. She went to boarding schools in the West, she went to Oxford, then she worked at the UN, and she had no understanding or connection with the needs of its people, except as kind of an icon who represented her father.
So the military, she was able to use the argument of her father's lineage with the military, but I'm guessing among the public, they have kind of mixed opinions about her, because she wasn't raised in the country. She came back in and rode the wave of what was happening in the 90s, late 80s, or 90s to power. Is that broadly accurate?
Yes, that's accurate. And also, she had no connection to. She's not an ethnic minority. She didn't have a connection to the ethnic minorities, and she didn't do much to bring them into her cabinet.
Let me ask you this: how do you think this ends up? And we can end it here. Like I said, we were just talking at this point. I was just curious. It's like one thing led to another in regards to some of the questions. And as you were talking, I was like, the questions were just bursting in my head. It was like, we have to follow up on this. We have to follow up. We can't end this. How does this end from your standpoint? At this point, the people in the streets are engaged. So it's not a situation where the military just took it and everybody just said, okay, well, the military got it. No, they got engaged. They put their cards on the public in order to stop the military and the police from basically affecting their will. It is clear at this point that she is being detained, and I would imagine the public believes it's probably under bogus, pretextual charges. So where does the public go at this point? Or maybe the larger question is, what happens? How does this end up? Is the military right that they can basically suppress this stuff for a year and then kind of regain control and keep it moving again? Or are they wrong on this? That the fact that the public believed it had a democracy is in and of itself enough for the public to basically fight for it. That's what I mean. That's why I see this is so fascinating.
It's anybody's guess, really. But the end game that the military wants is they want things to calm down, and then they want to hold the election again. They already get 25% of the votes, through the Constitution. But their calculation is that the NLD will be significantly weakened if they recast the votes and allow all the ethnic minorities whose votes were disenfranchised to vote in a fair election. So that's part of their calculation. Now, that said, if that doesn't go well, if the U.S. escalates, if there's more intervention, and I'm seeing a lot of U.S. led or U.S. influenced protests. I didn't go too much into that, but a lot of the protests are in English, or they're in English signs. They're only 5% of the population that speak English in Burma.
Whoa, so those are specific
already,
for the American audience or English-speaking audiences. Because otherwise, why are they speaking in English?
But they would also be set up by English-speaking outsiders would be the assumption, or insiders. But again, it would be largely a press ploy, from what you're saying.
Yes, it's the NED. The NED has sunk. Sinks about $3 million every year. They have 80 ongoing projects, quote unquote, for democratization, and so they are doing a lot of these protests for the Western audience or for the Western press.
The NED is basically a front for the CIA. It's the way. I mean, I could show. I need to find an interview where the guy basically makes the point of saying, with these groups like this, we have with our governmental, NGOs, we have the capability of getting money into countries in order to funnel this money to various people and organizations and opposition forces without ever getting our hands on it. That's shocking. So they are basically fostering protests.
I think of course, there's indigenous rage. I mean, this is a coup. Of course, people are angry and upset with it. But also, some of these protests look very highly organized. They're using very specific tactics that you see in the kind of Western, they're mediagenic Western protests. Only 5%. I mean, this is like if Black Lives Matter suddenly came out with thousands of placards in Chinese. You'd start scratching your head, right?
Yeah,
that would be utterly bizarre, but it's clearly targeted. Clearly targeted. KJ, I really appreciate this, man. The voice, voice
thank you
guys were listening to. KJ No is a journalist, political analyst, writer, and teacher specializing in geopolitics of the Asia-Pacific region. He is a contributor to the book Capitalism on a Ventilator. Once censored by Amazon, it is now available at the iacenter.org. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
We're out. And by the way, KJ, this is all going up on this is all on Jamarl's YouTube channel right now. We're going to cut the sort of plan bit out from the first 15 minutes. We're going to air that tomorrow, but we're also live right this second. So we do have an audience, and we'll send you that link a little bit later so you have that for yourself.
All right.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, thank you
for the call. Yeah, this was a fascinating interview. It was Shane. What happened was, like, as he finished, I was like, wait, we can't end on that.
And the bit about the NED at the end, I wish we'd gotten that into the main section. That's super relevant.
Because it gets into the whole thing of whether the U.S. is getting involved, and oftentimes it gets involved through these type of NGOs. And so this is a fascinating interview, to put it mildly. It was just like when it ended, I was like, wait, we can't end it there. Then there has been a follow-up question. There has been a follow-up.
And clearly, there would have been enough for a second segment, but hey, it is what it
actually,
is.
we could use this for a second segment. I mean, it went 15 minutes.
We could if we wanted to. We would just manually intro it and outro it, and I might be willing to do that. It depends on how many other guests we get if we need to fill any spots. If that makes sense.
And the second part, I got to be honest, was just as good as the first, if not better.
It was, yeah. It was a little bit more all over the place, but we covered a lot of good ground, and what we got to there, it was very good.
Right,
it was very good.
So let's end this. All right, guys. You guys got a sneak preview of what is taking place on Fault Lines tomorrow in regards to the interview. KJ No is fascinated, to put it mildly. And I got to be honest, I could have kept this going for like an hour. He was that fascinated. But I'm going to end this here. I'm going to tell you guys, like, share, hit that subscription button, and make sure you are indeed subscribed. And I'll see you guys in a few. Thanks all.